This morning, I find myself in France after leaving England at midnight 30. I quite like saying that.
Midnight 30.
The reason for that is we have to be in France, do this show, and then get back to England within one day, because our schedules are so busy and we're such in demand by our children, mostly because he has to go to rugby in the morning. We have come to talk to my father, who is sat to my right, Richard Ballard. Oh, that's weird, isn't it, saying your name? The reason I wanted to do this is because my father is 86 years old. He lives in France. He has lived a long and varied life, but also can give us a history of things, can show us the progression from the war upwards to now, and also maybe we can get into our pet subject, which is loss of community, loss of, people having a support system that is in their community, which used to be organised religion, but we'll get to that. So let's start where all things should start, at the beginning. Thank you for letting us do this.
I'm honoured.
That's fine. Right, look, where were you born?
Plaistow Hospital, East London.
East London. Okay, so you're born to, who were your parents?
David Ballard and Mabel Ballard.
David Ballard.
Yeah.
See, I'd forgotten that. Okay, and what did they do, respectively?
Well, Dad was a sailor. He was quietly sitting on a park bench in 1917, and a girl gave him a white feather.
Right.
And so he thought, I don't really want to be a soldier. It's nasty in Flanders. There's mud and stuff. I'll do what my dad has done. I'll join the Navy.
Right.
So he went and saw his father, which was not all that strange, who was a master at arms, that's a naval sergeant major, in charge of Chatham Barracks prison.
Oh.
And my grandfather said to him, look, if you're going to join the Navy, boy, don't do it here, because you might end up in my clink. Go to Portsmouth. So he took himself off to Portsmouth and he joined something called HMS Fizguard, which was an institution for training engine room artificers. And that took quite a long time to train. He did 2 years training. By that time, it was 1918. And he got the medal for the First World War, but no more white feathers.
What's the deal with the white feather?
The white feather was what girls gave to young men who they thought were cowards, because they hadn't joined the army.
Oh. Oh, I didn't know that.
I don't know.
Okay.
And there was a lot of it going on. Dad was certainly not a coward. He was a rugby forward, and when he was in the Navy, he played rugby for the United Services.
Okay.
And was really rather good at it. Until he fell down a companionway one day on board ship and gave himself a hernia. But he had this phobia of anaesthetics, so he refused to have it operated. So my lords of the Admiralty said, well, if you won't have the operation, you must leave the Navy. So after 11 years service, he found himself in the middle of the slump without a job, which was a bit awkward.
Yeah.
And he was rather an aggressive type, and he got a job at something called Fulmer Oil Burners, and the foreman upset him, so he floored him, and so he lost that job too.
Right.
But 2 years later, he was chief maintenance engineer at Harrods, which wasn't a bad thing.
Yeah, because I always remember there was a conversation about Harrods, and basically Harrods, I don't know if it still does, but they have lights, or had light strings on the top of the roof. And he made the generators that kept all that running, right?
Because he understood turbines. He trained on turbines for the Navy. And in 1936 or so, Harrods decided to install an electricity plant based on turbines. And they took him on and put him in charge. And it was a wonderful job. So we moved away from Camberwell, and they bought a house in Rains Park, southwest 20,
Southwest 20, yeah.
And life was sweet.
Okay, so how old are you now in Southwest 20?
Well, I was born in 1937.
Right.
So, yeah. So, you know, I was born in Camberwell and moved to Rains Park pretty well soon after.
Right. Okay.
And when the war started, I was 3.
You were 3 when the war started. Are you cognizant of that? Do you remember what the war did?
Well, I remember the Blitz because I was beginning to take notice. I was nearly 4 then.
Good heavens.
And my mother had fantastic ways of dealing with it. She said, oh, they're moving pianos about up in the sky. And I said, no, they're not. They're dropping bombs. And they're letting off fireworks in the sky. No, they're not. They're shooting at airplanes.
Right. So you knew what was happening.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we'd had this shelter built in the garden, and we all knew the name Anderson, and we knew a chap called Chamberlain, who apparently wasn't much cop. And there was this fellow with a name that began with H that I struggle to remember, who kept on sending these aeroplanes over to bomb the docks, and some of them got lost. They used to fly across the North Sea and turn left at Haileybury Dome, and come and bomb the docks. But some of them didn't know where to stop, and they kept on flying, and they got to Rains Park, and they said, we used to come here for the tennis, and because it was next door to Wimbledon, of course.
Yeah.
And one day, one of them crashed a few streets away.
Right.
And Mrs. Conley, our neighbour, came and said to my mother, here, Mabe, did you hear that bang last night and that plane came down? And she said, yeah, it was awful, wasn't it? Woke us up. And so she said she would go around with Mrs. Conley and have a look at it. And I thought this was interesting, so I rushed out of the front door, caught my foot on the doorstep, and split my chin.
Right.
Whereupon my mother said, "Oh, we must take him to the hospital, quick!" So she got out the humiliating pushchair that only a few weeks before had been put away for good. And I was put in the pushchair and taken to the hospital, and they said, "Well, that's pretty serious. It'll have to be stitched, and we'll have to make sure how it goes. So he'll have to stay overnight." And my mother said, "No child of mine is staying in this hospital with the bombs falling." So she rang up her friend Maud Lewington, who happened to live in a place called Oxford, which was well out of the way. And apparently there was a rumour that if we didn't bomb Heidelberg, where there was a university, Hitler wouldn't bomb Oxford, where there was also a university, you might remember.
Yeah, yeah.
So we went there. We were going to stay for a couple of weekends. We stayed for 6 years.
Well, yeah, but there's a bit you're missing out, right?
Yes.
Well, it's quite lucky you knew the word Anderson, wasn't it not? Because what happened to your house?
Yeah, it got bombed.
Yeah. So.
And Dad used to commute up and down between Oxford and Harrods. But one day we found him on a Wednesday. And he usually came on Friday night and left on Sunday night. But he came on a Wednesday. And he said, "It's no good, we can't go back. It's been bombed." And that place under the stairs where we decided to shelter instead of going down to the Anderson was completely wiped out. So it's a good job we were here, or I was on nights. And so that was that. We'd finished with Rains Park.
Right.
And Jim Lewington, my father's friend, decided after the Blitz to go back to New Malden where he lived.
Yep.
Because it was reasonably safe now. And the Germans had found out where the docks were, and when they decided occasionally to bomb them, they got the hits in the right place. So Dad and Jim changed jobs. So Dad spent the rest of the war as the maintenance engineer at a dairy, which was just behind the house, because the house was a tight house that went with a job at the dairy. And if you want to see what it looks like, you published a little novel called A Child's War, and my drawing of the house is on the front of it.
Okay. Can I ask something? Right, you've lost everything, presumably.
Well, there were a few.
apart from the suitcase.
The only thing that wasn't damaged was the furniture in the front room, and that arrived in a lorry a few weeks later.
Right. So as a whatever 5-year-old, 6-year-old, how does it feel to lose everything as a child? Do you remember?
Yeah. Well, I lost the toys, I suppose.
Yeah.
But Dad was still at Harrods, so still had a few privileged toys. I used to like books, and still do, of course, and they'd all gone.
Yeah.
But the main effect was on the mental health of my poor mother, who she'd had a rather deprived childhood. Her mother died when she was 16, and she had to look after her 3 sisters.
Right.
And her father, after he left the lights on one night at the tram depot in which he was in charge of, and the Zeppelin went over and bombed the hell out of it, he took to drink, so she was in a bit of a state about all that.
Yeah.
But at last, after 20 years, she'd got her life together and was living the life she always wanted, in a nice house in a nice part of London, and with nice neighbours, and she lost it all, and sank into a sort of paranoia, and also she got cancer, and that didn't help. Though she did live till she was 80, but she lived a very miserable life, and well, an unhappy life, I mean.
Yeah.
And she never saw the good in anything, really.
No. No. Well, I mean, I don't have any memories because I might have met her, but I don't remember. I certainly never met your dad because he died before I was born.
Yeah.
But from the sounds of him, you've always said that I'm very much like him. You know, rugby playing bloke who laid out his boss.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, hello. Just that striking in chords. Yeah. So we've got to the war, and so after that, where do you go? You stay in Oxford for 6 years.
Yeah, but it was quite interesting that going to school in wartime was quite something. I mean, the whole nation was geared up to war. We used to take our used toothpaste tubes
Yeah.
to be turned into Spitfires or Hurricanes or later on bombers. And one thing I remember specifically is that all through the war, there was sort of hate talk going on all the time, the Jerrys, and we're going to bomb them to bits, and we heard the airplanes going over, and then suddenly it was all over, and lorries full of bedraggled Germans were taken through the town, and at first some of the boys and the girls used to hurl abuse and mud pies and God knows what at them, and the headmistress, Miss Lambourne, said, "Now look, we've fought the Germans, we've won, and now it's our business to be the gracious winner. So don't throw dirty paper bags at the Germans as they go through. Don't do anything." And there were some Italian prisoners down Binsey Lane who were more or less kept in fields. And Dad used to stop and talk to them because he knew a few words of Italian, having lived in Malta for some years. Getting used to the change between war and peace was a bit awkward.
Well, yeah. I mean, you're given a situation where you're told actively to hate, because these are your enemies. And then as a child, how do you suddenly do a 360, and go
Well,
back
it
the other way?
was difficult because we thought that Germans were, as you say, enemies and repulsive and not to be taken on at all.
Mostly because propaganda works well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? At the end of the day, you don't... I mean, the likelihood of you actually knowing any Germans, is very slim.
Well, I took a German O-level some years later, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, as a child, you're influenced by your surroundings and the people around you, and you're not going to suddenly realise that the Germans are just humans like you are, and they're led by a different person with a different set of agendas. Hitler did well. He turned Germany round, didn't he? And everyone looked up to him as a great hope, and then he turned into a mass murdering fuckhead. If you'll pardon my language.
And of course we'd listened to this chap called Churchill who said, we shall fight them on the beaches, we shall never surrender. The pictures we had in the magazines, like the Picture Post, were all of hate figures, as you say. We had songs about Hitler being deficient in some sense, and poor old Goebbels.
Well, he had no balls, did he, at
all?
all?
No.
I mean,
at school we used to sing this, marching along in the playground. The girls too.
Well, I'm not being funny. I think I sang that at school as well. Yeah, I mean, some of these things don't go away. Also, I mean, the fixation with Hitler still. The celebration of the Second World War on the History Channel. It's called the Hitler Channel for a reason. And a celebration of the obliteration of human beings strikes me as very strange.
You remember at Stegursey, that chap who was a bomb aimer. What was his name?
I was 4, right?
No. This was years. Yeah, but you used to drink his beer and
Coleman, Max Coleman.
Yeah, Max Coleman.
Drink his beer, age 4. Yes.
After the war, he told me. Well, as soon as the war ended, they put him back in the bomber and made them fly over the ruined cities to see what they'd done. On orders,
What to what end?
So that they would know what they'd done and remember
pride?
it.
Or that doesn't make any sense. They'd remember it. They'd remember it anyway. But what were the higher ups wanting to achieve?
Well, they wanted to say, look, don't let this happen again.
I hate to say this, but they should be turning around going, that's up to you,
well,
son.
That's what I thought. But that's what they did. Whenever he talked about this, he used to cry.
Yeah.
Because he knew what he'd done and he'd been involved in.
So then they're apportioning blame to the people taking orders?
No, they're not doing that. The idea was that you should see what you've done and know the price of fighting a war is.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can see that because I suppose the more people who are involved know how tragic and devastating it is, then they can make sure that in their lifetimes it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. Well, the trouble is that their lifetime has run out.
Yeah. And then look what's happening.
Well, I mean, the pictures of Gaza are unwatchable, aren't they? And the pictures of Ukraine are unwatchable.
You see, this is what's the scariest thing about human beings, and why ultimately we're going to destroy ourselves, is because you don't learn from the past. We never have. All of these conflicts, all the way through, it's cyclical. You have peace for a certain amount of time, and then people forget. I want to go back to the war, though. I want to look at the community, the sense of belonging to the people in your communities. Was that real, or is that just a picture painted?
Well, let's start with our arrival in Oxford. Lots of Londoners had gone there. Some of them children on their own with labels on them, and initially they were rejected. They weren't taken on by families. There was this scandal of the only place given for them to sleep, the families who arrived in 1940, was a disused cinema.
Great.
And there were 500 people in there, and gents' lavatory there, ladies' lavatory there, and only about 3 of them anyway. And the shops didn't really want to serve the evacuees. The children were all right because they went to West Oxford Infant School, which was, because of the teaching staff there, geared up to take them on. And they did take us on and looked after us.
What was the thinking behind not wanting to take them on? I mean, it's not, they're the same race, colour and creed, but slightly different accents, presumably. But
Yeah. Well, a lot of the East Londoners were poor.
yeah.
So all the nice middle-class people in West Oxford thought that they were not the sort of people they mixed with.
Well, they're aliens, aren't they? They're aliens. They're foreign to that area, aren't they? It's just that
And
these
of
days
course-
those areas are bigger, aren't they?
And of course, in 1940, there was still all this tribalism going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that it's quite easy to forget, with all the collection of information we have, the world's a bigger place, and it's not just about me talking to you and passing stories on, it's about, me talking to somebody over on a different side of the world.
And we didn't have television, and certainly not 24-hour news. All through the war, we had the 6 o'clock news and the 1 o'clock news and the 7 o'clock news.
On the wireless.
On the wireless, and that's what we had. And, this is the 1 o'clock news, and this is Elvar Dell reading it.
Yes.
And in this strange accent, which now I have no bottom teeth, I can't really imitate. But we used to have Mr. Churchill with his strange voice, which we all imitated. The thing was that we didn't fit.
Yeah.
And by the end of the war, we did. When the solidarity was somewhat greater. When the prisoners from the Japanese camp started to come home, then there was something called solidarity. Colin Green, who lived next door to us, had been 3 years in Singapore, and he came back a skeleton.
Yeah.
His poor old mum, when he was taken, just sort of collapsed.
Yeah.
It was a sort of time I didn't know it was strange, nor did any boy my age.
Because you'd grown up in it.
Yeah, we thought it was normal, and when Jean Sampson, who lived next door, one May morning rushed out of the house and said the war's over, we didn't know what to do. We weren't taking our toothpaste tubes to school anymore. We weren't.
Can I point out, right, the reason the toothpaste tubes were taken were because they were metal lined, right, and that's how harsh metal had got. There wasn't any. So toothpaste tubes from school kids made aeroplanes, just to clarify.
And I was astonished when I went back to Oxford for another reason years later, to find that the railings had been put back on the front walls of the houses.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing as well, isn't it? When is it symbolic that you remove the barriers in front of people's houses? Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's a strange.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange notion, isn't it? You're behind your metal gates and your railings, and then they're all taken because there is no metal.
And so another thing I remember is that a strange shed appeared in our garden, and I was never allowed to go into it. And I said, "Why?" And Dad said, "Don't ask. Just don't ask, because I'm not going to tell you."
Okay.
When I, threw the toys out of my pram because of that.
Yeah.
But what he was doing was making ball bearings. He'd been supplied with a little lathe,
Yeah.
and these ball bearings were taken in strange little bags every Saturday to the post office.
Right.
Nobody knew they were ball bearings. But because we'd been bombing all the ball bearing factories we could find in Germany, we didn't want ours bombed.
Right.
So that the ships would still, you know, so naval pensioners, as Dad was, they got about fourpence a week because he'd been invalidated out because of his hernia.
Yeah.
Were provided with sheds and lathes, and they made ball bearings.
And they're sworn to secrecy. Isn't that strange?
But then the doodlebug started. And so all the gardens were taken over with breeze block built area shelters. So the shed went.
Yeah.
But by that time, Britannia was ruling the waves again, it was said, though it was ships from another country that were actually ruling the waves.
Yeah.
So Dad's ball bearings were no longer required. But he was, after all, he was quite proud of that, you know, that craftsmen like him used a little bit of their craft.
Yeah. To make something absolutely functional. To make things turn, literally.
Yeah.
Okay, so when coming out of that war, was there a, you know, there's this rosy painting of people, you know, pulling together, and, you know, if someone didn't have this for their rationing, somebody else did, or whatever like that. I can't believe that was reality. Was it?
Well, and the story I told you about the eggs might come in here. Mum found out that there was a farm quite a bus ride away that was willing to sell eggs for an exorbitant price.
Yeah.
And when Dad came up at weekends, as he did for a little while, she wanted to make nice cakes. Now, she couldn't do it without eggs, so we got on the bus and we went to this place and we bought a shopping bag full of eggs. And on the way back, the bus was full. And so I decided I would sit on my mother's knee, but what I actually sat on was a bag of eggs.
Oh, God.
She wasn't very happy at the best of times, and she exploded. And I remember I was walking back from the bus stop with sort of egg white dripping out of the bottom of her coat, and I was sent to bed for a week or something. And this bag was hung up to dry. I've been washed. And Dad came up at the weekend with a box of a dozen eggs, and we needn't have bothered with all that. But you know, the eggs were rationed, and if you wanted any, you had to join the black market. And I remember you saying to me at the time, you know, that's real social history, because we didn't know all that before. No. But we all had orange juice. Government orange juice was supplied to families.
Vitamin C and all that.
Yeah, and school milk came in. So we were probably better nourished than we were before, because we were eating the right things and not the wrong things.
Yeah.
And when I'd been run over, there was two spin-offs from that. Is that I qualified for nice food, and the other thing was that because the Americans were all round us, and they wanted to repair their broken airmen without sending them back to America, they were working on Alexander Fleming's chance discovery of penicillin in the hospital I went to, the Radcliffe Infirmary, and they tested it on me, or I was one of the people they tested it on. So, though I'd had a fractured skull.
Can I just say, can you say what happened? You can't just say I got run over.
Well, I got fed up with my mother saying to me every time I went out, look both ways across the road. So I didn't. And
mindless rebellion ending in being hit by a truck.
Yeah. And so I had a fractured skull and a lacerated leg.
Oh my God.
And my mother came out and saw me. And a woman said, well, don't push your way in. We all want to see what's happened. And she said, that's my boy there. And so I was taken to the hospital and woke up after 3 days to hear a doctor on the other side of the screen saying to my mother, he will come round, Mrs. Ballard, but he might need special needs.
Oh.
And so I said, Mum, what special needs? And she said, well, you might be balmy rich. which didn't help, you know.
No, no, not at all.
And Dad came in and sort of went like that, and I said 4, and Mother said I've done all that, but the spin-off was this, that because he'd given up the dairy by then, he was maintenance engineer at an American hospital, a place called Wheatley, and the Americans collected all their comic books and gave them to Dad to bring to me. And Dad added pencils and paints and stuff, and I copied the pictures in the what I now call bande dessinée, and learned how to draw. And that's, you know, a lifetime's, what my French neighbours call passion, and turned that to advantage a lot.
So your whole art fixation started by copying American comics?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Because they were wonderful drawings, I mean, as you remember. All the action, and Dad encouraged me. I used to draw, you know, little battle scenes, because that's, you know, that was in the air. And drawing little men running is quite an experience, really.
It's quite difficult.
They either move or they don't.
Yeah.
And one thing Dad did, he was very economically minded, so I was allowed as much paper as I needed. But Dad would look at my drawings and always turn it over to see if I'd used both sides.
Right.
And then, hernia and all, he came home one day with a second-hand bike he'd bought. And he fitted a little saddle on the crossbar. And he rode all over Oxfordshire with me on this thing. And that's why I like history, because we went in every church in the county. And he looked at all the gravestones and said, 1759, loss of Quebec. He connected all things together, because later on I found that in my grand's house in Kent, in Gillingham, there was a Cassell's Illustrated History of England, which he'd spent his evenings going through.
Studying.
And it had marvellous pictures of all sorts of things that happened, and costumes and uniforms and all that, and he'd taken all that in.
Right.
And so when he found a trigger, like a date on a tombstone, he would tell the story.
Yeah.
And that's what kindled my interest.
You see, it's funny to see, you know, people in our family past, you know, and the progression of yourself. So your art comes from comics, because you got all that time in hospital and all of these GIs giving you their comics and their chocolate, presumably. And then, you know, then that goes on. And then your love of history comes because your dad, you know, you can see the train of thought, you know, and also, you know, again, you saying I'm like your father.
Well, because you have his engineering skills. You taught yourself to weld.
I did, yes.
Yeah, you know, it seems to be in the genes somehow that the skills needed to be an engineer or artificer were passed on. They missed me. I mean,
which is pretty mind-numbingly weird, because I never met the man. But I have met him through you, haven't I? I mean, you know, you've told me stories, you've done all of that. That's good.
Well, behind Lee's head, there's a picture of him in uniform when he was 17.
Right.
Which I respect, because he looks like us, and he was a strong personality, and all credit to him. I mean, while his wife was disintegrating, he stood by her, and although his family had rejected him because he married her, because he felt sorry for her. Grandfather was prominent in Freemasonry, as they say, and he'd arranged for Dad to get on the square, as they say, one weekend when he was on leave from the Navy, and Dad decided to get married instead. And that,
when you say get on the square, what do you mean?
well, it means become a Freemason.
Oh, I didn't know that.
On a set square.
Oh, okay.
When you said there about it skipped you, they're still both creative things, though, aren't they? And
Yeah.
your situation, by the sounds of it, because you were recuperating from your accident. You just your mindset just went down that path and then became more artistic, but still both creative, aren't they?
Well, you're right. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I think
creative in a
that's-
different
it's
way.
that-
Yeah.
it's that
The
that's
funniest
been-
thing, though, right, is that I remember, I think we were at my grandmother's house, and I don't know, I can't remember where we were, but you were building something, and we all knew to stay the fuck out of the way until that rubbish had finished. You know, putting up a shelf and all of that. I mean, you could do it all now, but back then you couldn't because it wasn't your world, and you didn't.
No.
You know, you hadn't done it. And I just remember my mother ushering me away, going, and I remember going, "Shouldn't I help?" And she went, "Oh God, no!" Pushing me away. That was quite funny. Okay, let's jump forward now. I'm interested in how the little boy from London through Oxford becomes what I keep calling you, which is a vicar, which you don't like. So,
See in the face.
yeah,
I was only a vicar for about 5 minutes. Yeah.
I had to apologise so many times for that because obviously, you know, in my head it's stuck fast that, you know, yes, you're a parish priest, but it's a vicar, isn't it? To me. But, you know, so how did that come about? So where were you at school, first of all? Like end of school?
I was at a place called Portsmouth Southern Grammar School, which was a state grammar school.
Okay, so
In-
you'd
in
moved
Portsmouth.
to Portsmouth by then?
Yeah. Well, after the war, the American hospital disappeared, and we had nowhere to live because the Tide House had gone as well. So we went and camped out in my grandmother's house because she was then a widow. And my mother declared war on us, so we couldn't stay there very long. And Dad got a job in Chatham Dockyard in the drawing office. And then a friend of his had moved to Portsmouth Dockyard and said, "Look, there's a job here which is going to be better for you." And so he applied for it and got it. And so we moved to Portsmouth. And that's how we ended up there. So went to the little primary school across the road from where we lived. And then passed the 11 plus and went to this grammar school.
Because the 11 plus wasn't something that, you know, a lot of people did, though, was it? I
Well,
mean,
we all did it.
You all did it, but you had to pass it and to move on.
and you know, poor blighters who didn't pass it got sort of shoved into a place where they had to go, but they didn't do much for 4 years. But I was lucky, and this was a good grammar school, and it had good teachers.
Were you lucky or were you clever?
Well, I would like to think both.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at,
I got a distinction at A-level history. Okay,
Yeah, right. that's it,
but because I was well taught.
Yeah, no, I get that. But without the propensity for knowledge, you're not going to get anywhere if you got.
Well, it was interesting.
Yeah, that's the thing. So, okay, so you Portsmouth Grammar School, you come out.
No.
No.
Portsmouth Southern Grammar School.
Oh well.
Portsmouth Grammar School was a direct grant school,
Well.
and a fee paying.
Oh. Oh yes, I went to those. Anyway.
Only because I was on the staff.
Oh yeah, that was all shit, wasn't it? I've lost my train of thought. Right, so you've come out of school, and then there's the conversation, right, with your mother about what you're going to do, or what was that? How did you get where you started?
Well, Dad said, if that girl hadn't given me a white feather, I'd have gone to a polytech or something, and wouldn't necessarily learn engineering, but would have learned some kind of higher education. So it'd be nice if you went to university. And the prelude to that was, I was, 7 or 8, and we were sitting on a bench in Tom Quad, Christchurch College, Oxford. Because the gardens of the colleges were open and we could all walk around them.
Yeah.
And Dad was reading the paper. And suddenly he said, "Here, there's a thing called the 1944 Education Act. And it says that boys of working class houses homes can go to university if they win scholarships. And I said, well, do you think I could do it? And he said, well, why not? I was 7 at the time.
Yeah. Bit
And
presumptuous.
so the idea was started, you know, that if you passed 11 plus, you could get A levels and you could go to university and get the money. Because I was lucky and I got a state scholarship. And Dad said one day, you're going to get £360 a year. Do you realise that that's half my annual pay? And I managed to pay the mortgage and keep you and your mum going. And you're not too badly dressed, are you? And, you know, nowadays, of course, you know, Alexander, Lydia, Serena have all got into horrible debt until about the age of 45.
Yeah. That is my sister's children, just because obviously you don't know who they are. Yeah, I mean, they're all very clever kids and they'll do well. I think where I'm angling at is that I remember us having a conversation and you probably flippantly said, you know, if there'd have been money, I'd have been a solicitor. As there wasn't, I had to become a... What is that? What should
Clergyman.
A clergyman. There you are. I'm still going to call you a vicar, mostly because it annoys you.
Yes.
No, I don't annoy you.
I see the point, yeah.
Yeah. So, that was loud. What happens when you choose that path? Now, you go to a special college.
Well, can I introduce it more? I mean,
can do
why
whatever
I
you
made
want.
the choice anyway.
Yeah, do it.
Because I got run over, I was a skinny kid. And my mother, choosing her words wisely, said, "Good Lord, Rich, you look like something out of Burson," which was pretty nasty.
Yep.
And so I needed fattening up, which she did with suet pudding, and exercise. And she thought it would be a good thing if I joined the Cubs. Well, the Cubs were attached to a Methodist church, and we used to have to go to the Methodist church once a month, and that was all right. It didn't hurt anybody. But then there was no scout group, and my mother insisted on me going to the scouts because that would continue to toughen me up. I wasn't in any way toughened up by being in the Cubs, I assure you.
You could tie a good knot, though, right?
No, I could tie a bad knot.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good, isn't it? As long as there were knots.
And so the scout group was attached to a high Anglican church,
Right.
St Bartholomew Southsea.
Okay, right. High church, low church. What's the deal?
Well, high church is sort of Catholic without the Pope.
Okay.
You know, I've got a ferret sticking up my nose.
Yeah. So singing the songs in incense and all that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and processions. And
Have I dreamt this? Or was I a boat boy once?
yes, it was cathedral.
Okay, so I didn't dream that. Right, a boat boy is where you're literally a kid in a cassock walking behind some geezer swinging this metal thing round his head that's giving out incense. And every so often he stops and opens the boat, gets his teaspoon and puts some more incense in his swingy thing. What's that called? Chalice?
It's called a thurible.
A what?
A thurible. A chalice is where you have the communion wine, but a
Yeah.
thurible is what you swing the incense.
Right. I was in Southwark Cathedral the other day, and I got in the way of a clergyman in a black cassock trying to put the blessed communion wine in some kind of safe, and he was none too happy about it. I was stood in the doorway, and he went like that, and I went, "All right, mate, what's the matter?" He went, He didn't use words. He was, and I'm thinking, well, the education is not quite what it was. Anyway, there you go. There's an aside.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so right.
And I got sort of sucked into this. I saw these young clergymen. There were 3 curates at the place, you know, and they, because Mum was ill, they were always around there, sort of. I liked the cut of their jib. You know, they talked nicely, and they read books, and they lent me books.
Right.
And one day I happened to be in the vicar's garden.
Oh, it's all right to call other people a vicar, then,
Well,
is
he
it?
was a vicar.
Oh, it's my mistake.
That's why he lived in a vicarage.
But we lived in 2 vicarages.
No, we didn't. We lived in 2 rectories.
Oh my God, I'm so
We need
confused.
to get a glossary of terms. sorted.
Yeah, well,
No.
yeah.
All right, just quickly. A rector is a chap who has the right to the living. The vicar is somebody who works for the rector and does the job vicariously.
Ooh.
There you go.
Vicarious.
And as your favourite Archdeacon Arthur Hopley once said, you don't want to do the job for somebody else, do you?
No, that's true. Right. Archdeacon Hopley, right, he got the hump with me because I hadn't walked yet. So he clapped his hands and said, "It's about time you walked, isn't it?" And apparently I did.
You just got up.
Got up and walked. Now, if that isn't divine intervention, I don't know what is. I've been touched by God himself. No, that obviously isn't true, is it? Okay, so, fine. So you're swayed by the lifestyle?
Well, no. Well, these educated blokes,
Yeah.
I thought wouldn't mind some of that.
Right.
And then the vicar said to me, I was 15, and he said, you might want to turn your collar around. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I have been thinking of it. And he said, well, the first thing to do is get yourself educated. Well, I was just about to go into the 6th form.
Right.
And I managed to win the scholarship when I went to a place called Lincoln College, Oxford, and to read history.
Right.
Because the bishop I was sent to see said, look, don't read theology as a first degree. That's always a mistake. Read something else, and then if it all goes pear-shaped, you can do something else. And so...
Practical information from a bishop.
Yeah.
Good grief.
Rare, that.
No, well,
Yeah.
yeah. Moving swiftly on.
Don't say any more.
Yes, no, I'm not.
So I thought, well, let's see. And I was encouraged. I was sent to the right committees who said, yes, you ought to be ordained. We detect a vocation in you. I didn't, but they did. And so I went to university with the idea of afterwards going to a theological college for another 2 years and then being ordained.
So presumably, if you're going to be ordained, you know, there are some people who want to go and do that. Do they turn them away if they're not suitable? I mean, you're educated. You've striven. Sorry, I've got a whistle because of these plastic teeth. So you've striven to get where you're going, and you've succeeded. So you know what happens to the stumps who don't get where you're going, the ones that, you know, because, you know, let's not forget, a lot of clergymen in England were the bastard sons of dukes and other people, weren't they? So, you know, you've got to be, they saw in you something they wanted.
Yeah.
Because did you have a belief system?
Oh, yes. I swallowed it whole.
Yeah?
At the time.
Yeah.
And was encouraged by the clergy at this church, who I seemed to fit in with. There was national service to cope with for 2 years first, before I went to university, and that was I used to do a sort of role play there. I'm going to be a clergyman. Yeah, and
hence you missed the whole Suez.
oh well, I missed that because I was on leave and nobody noticed.
Nobody noticed. Yeah, don't bother calling him back.
Well, I came back and the only person on the camp was the station warrant officer, and I said, "What shall I do, sir?" And he said, "Get lost, boy, get lost. You're ruining my figures." And so I spent a week in Bournemouth while the others were off in Cyprus controlling airplanes.
Right.
Well, they weren't controlling airplanes because they weren't officers, but they were doing what they did in the New Forest, which was polish radar sets.
Useful shit
And
stuff.
and eat wagon wheels in the naffy and that sort of thing.
they have wagon wheels back then?
Yeah, they've just been invented. They were new things.
Yeah, now, yeah. Oh, they're despicable things now. Anyway, so, okay, so you go to Wells
Yeah.
for the first time. Because
Yes,
obviously we end up living in the same damn street later on in life.
Yes, I'd come a long way in my career, all of 50 yards.
Yeah, 50 yards. Went from number 4 to number 18.
Number 2, actually.
Number 2. Oh, see, almost. Okay, so look, I'm aware of time. So you've got yourself into this position, right? And then you are ordained, presumably, because otherwise it would be criminal.
I went to be a missionary in darkest West Surrey.
Did you? Did you manage to convert many?
No.
No. Okay. I often find that, when you try and break up tribes, such as Surrey dwellers, it's often very difficult to break their beliefs. Anyway, so...
No, but that was at a time when people still went to church.
Yeah. Okay. That's the psychic is where we are. Okay. Lee and I have had conversations many times about the loss of the importance of organised religion for people. Now, there's many reasons for this. One is that everyone is now not dependent on their local everything for their way of life, right? They're more influenced by the television and the internet and the information overload that they get. So, as somebody who was in that, did you notice a decline in churchgoers? The community in those churches?
Yes. But I wasn't in that situation long enough because after 5 years as a curate, after 3 years as a curate, I was cut in two and sent to teach at a school as well. And then I was a school chaplain and remained a school chaplain for some years.
Yeah.
So I wasn't in a position to notice the point where the pews were empty.
No.
And I think largely because most churchgoers went to Sunday evening service. Uncle back from evensong called the cook and did her wrong. Hubert, I'm surprised, said Auntie when she caught them in flagrante. There's a time and place for gaieties. Pray remember, dear, what day it is.
Good grief. Right.
But you see, that all stopped because the saint was on the television.
Yeah. Well, that's it. You need. That's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
The saint was on the television. Well done,
Stop
you.
people going to church.
Well, you don't need to go to church when the saint's in the box in the corner. You don't have to go and listen to the diatribe from the man up there who hasn't really got a fucking clue what he's talking about. Well, not all of them. But look, there's the trouble is, right? The trouble is when the Church of England became a business, right? And the believers then stopped listening to the people because the people leading them didn't have the same interests.
I'd like to analyse that a bit.
Go on.
The Church of England used to be a national church. It was the church the English people stayed away from. The Catholics the Roman Catholics were a sort of diversionary group on the side. There were the Protestant churches, the Congregationists, the Methodists, the Baptists.
Yeah.
And they had their own organisation. But the Church of England, in the part of it I was in anyway, the middle, didn't demand a conversion experience. You were assumed to belong.
Right.
And the clergy visited. I used to knock on doors, as you know, in Stagersey quite a lot. And people didn't say, I'm a Roman Catholic, I'm a Baptist, I'm a Methodist, and therefore don't need you, because we have our own clergy. You regarded yourself as their clergyman, their priest.
So that's interesting. So it didn't matter what foot they kicked with, religiously speaking. It was just about you're the person in this place.
Yeah.
But you've always said it's all about pastoral care rather than religious.
I was about to ask that question. What did you see your purpose as? Was it to spread the word of God, or was it to provide care to the community?
I think it was more the second. One of the things that, because I in a little village. What was Stigursi? 3,000 people. And it was two communities, one for the Hinkley Point Power Station, where they were all Midlanders and Northerners, and the Somerset people. And you knew most of them. And you knew the gypsies too.
Yeah.
And the focus of the place was the village school, as you may remember. So we were a real community,
Yeah.
and suddenly that stopped. The bus service improved. People went to Bridgewater to work rather than working on the farms.
Yeah.
You didn't need a ring fence around it.
No.
You left in the morning on the bus and you came back in the evening to eat and sleep.
Yeah.
And the church became much more a spare time occupation than it was before. It used to be somewhere near the centre of the village, mentally.
Yeah.
And now it isn't.
Do you think that the larger the scope, the greater the loss of God? God being, whatever God is.
No, I think that people like you and me are now feel free to develop their own ideas of God, rather than have it directed from a pulpit.
I've been rather vocal about that. I mean, I genuinely believe, right, that I don't have a belief system, i.e. I don't believe that there is someone, but I do believe that if you have problems, you and I talk about rumination a lot, right? Rumination are bad negative thoughts about situations you can't change, right? If you don't vocalize that, if you don't talk about that, right, they stay cyclical.
Exactly.
And you spiral downwards. Now, when you're in a small community, gossip is rife, right? But the one person you can trust is that figurehead who stands in front of that church. Because it doesn't
go any further.
It doesn't go any further. You can go and bare your soul to this man.
And there's someone to go to. I mean, who have people got to go to now?
Well, they've got the great wide internet full of strangers and perverts and weird heads, and it's odd because there is no directional thought about vocalization. Now everyone reaches for a therapist, but you have to pay for that, right?
Yeah, so in which case they don't. That's the point, isn't it? A lot of people don't because they can't.
They can't,
And
yeah.
that's
They don't see themselves. They don't see themselves as people who live in a community where there is pastoral help.
After I'd retired, I did a year as an assistant priest in a London church. The vicar had gone on his holidays and I was minding the shop. And I had a phone call which said, my wife's just died. Could you come round? And, wasn't the first time.
No.
And it had all stopped happening. And the man was in tears of regret, because they were rather estranged in their last years. And I did what you've spoken about so often, just listen.
Yeah.
And listening and being silent, not interjecting, saying, I know how you feel.
Yeah.
Because you don't.
No. And also, you can't detract from somebody's story by interjecting with your own. It doesn't make people feel better.
Yeah.
When somebody's telling
were
you
you
that.
coached to do that, or was that just something you naturally did? Was that part of training?
I suppose we were coached by implication.
Right.
But the trouble is, it's one of the things you learn on the job because you can't learn it in theory. You either can or you can't. I think I was a bit useful because, well, don't want to boast, but I think I could.
Well, people came to me to talk to me at Haileybury because they knew that you listened to people. And when there was, I can't remember the situation, but you had to deal with, someone had died.
Well, it was my colleague, Mr. Stewart.
Oh, right. Alan Stewart had died, yeah. And then, yeah, all these people came, like, to you, and you were dealing with them, and then somebody else came to the house, and they'd said to me, can we just talk? And, you know, now I recognise what I did. I didn't do a damn thing. I sat there and listened to what the man had to say about how he felt. And for once in my life, I kept my mouth shut. Because the trouble is, if you interject on people's pain, right, and, you know, you try and go, oh, yes, well, when I was blah, blah, I dealt with that. What you do is detract from their story. They need to tell you all. It doesn't matter whether you fucking understand them or not. You know, you make a grunting noise in the right place is a hell of a lot more important than it is to give them a, you know, oh, I feel your pain. Well, you fucking don't, do you? Because even if it is the same type of pain, it's not the same type of pain.
Well, yes. I mean, I lost your mother by then. And I'd been there, done that.
Yeah, I mean, you could have done the whole, well, yes, well, you see, I lost my... It's not about you in that position. Yeah. This is what I do try and say to people is, you know, if somebody comes to you for that, and I'm going to have to sum up because we are running way out of time, but we're going to do another show.
Well, let's come back to the community bit.
Okay, go on.
Because on the whole, the Anglican clergy have rather given up on the visiting because they don't live in villages.
Yeah.
And what do you do with a tower block? I mean, when that tower block burned down in London, how could you minister to that?
I have no idea.
They ministered to each other.
Yeah. Well, they formed the groups.
And you see, the role of the Anglican clergy has completely changed. The Church of England is an option now. You don't have a sort of passport that says Church of England.
No.
People used to make the joke when it said religion on a thing. Oh, put down Church of England. You can't now because it's not true. Church of England is a choice, like being a Baptist is a choice, or being a Roman Catholic is a choice.
Or being an atheist and having nothing.
Yeah.
Apart from yourself, yeah.
So people suggest that I've left the church. I would like to say, no, the church left me. Because it's over the 60 years I've been an ordained minister of the Church of England. A clerk in holy orders. The role is entirely different, and I don't want the role.
Yeah, you don't want the progression of that role.
Yeah,
you don't want to be part of that, and I can see that.
So for me to be a school chaplain was the perfect solution, really.
Yeah.
I got up in Westminster Abbey in my red dress and.
Being a minor canon of the Abbey or whatever.
Well,
is that right?
They called them priest vicars.
Vicars, yeah.
But I mean, if we're coming to an end, can I just use this anecdote? Yes. There's a talk of community that you've raised in lots of these shows, which was very impressive. The date was the 2nd of February, the feast of the presentation of Christ in the temple. And there I was, in the Abbey pulpit, one of the most privileged places in the world, and I was using the story, and I had Mary coming to Jesus saying, where were you? We were looking for you. Your father and I have sought thee sorrowing. And he says, don't you know I must be about my father's business? And I imagine Joseph turning to him and saying, don't speak to your mother like that. And every head in the place turned towards me. If that's not community, what is?
Absolutely that.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, look, again, thank you for doing this. We're going to do another show as well while we're here. But that's more about the personal side of ageing and going through. The thing that I have learnt from you is the fact that, you know, intelligence isn't a bad thing. Knowledge isn't a bad thing. But empathy is something that instead of just paying lip service to, you can actually live without damaging yourself in any way. Because listening really is about listening. It isn't middle ground. It isn't same type of pain. What it is somebody being given the opportunity to rid themselves of all of the plague that they have in their head ruminating around. And I think, you know, I want to thank you for that lesson, because now I'm 50, because, you know, 50 and coping. Now I've got to the age where I'm not rebelling against anything because there's nothing fucking left and there wasn't anything in the first place. Now I can see that empathy and listening, and also to some extent finding community, be that with other people or be that in a way of thinking, is important. So look, for this one, 50 and coping, live from Versailles, near Paris. We'll see you next time.